I've always believed flowers could tell stories. Stories of joy, loss, and love. I see it every day in my small shop on Pine Street, where I arrange petals into whispers of emotion. Some bouquets sing of happiness. Others weep of farewells. I thought I'd seen every kind of love until the day Martina waltzed into my shop. She was a force of nature, commanding, elegant, the kind of woman who didn't ask for what she wanted. She demanded it. Martina was planning her engagement party, and I was her chosen florist. From the moment she began listing peonies and gardenias as if she were naming weapons for war, I knew this would be no ordinary client. Then I met Luke. He walked into my shop 2 days later, carrying an air of effortless charm and a smile so warm it could melt glaciers. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped in, his presence commanding my attention without a single word. His suit jacket hugged broad shoulders, and his tie was slightly loosened, hinting at a man who wasn't afraid to defy perfection. "Cal, right?" His voice was rich, grounded. He extended a hand. "I'm Luke." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to shake his hand, but because the intensity of his gaze caught me off guard. His blue eyes, the kind that seemed to hold secrets, locked onto mine with a quiet confidence. I took his hand, and the contact sent a jolt through me, like a static shock but deeper, more profound. "Nice to meet you," I managed, my voice steady despite the sudden flutter in my chest. "I just wanted to thank you for helping Martina with the flowers. She's been raving about your work," he said, his hand lingering a fraction too long before letting go. I wanted to tell him it was just a job, that I'd done 100 weddings before his. But the truth was, nothing about him, or this, felt ordinary. "She has good taste," I said instead, forcing a smile. He chuckled, his laugh soft and genuine. "That she does." We talked for a while longer. About flowers, the shop, even the weather. It wasn't the conversation itself that stood out, but the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person in the room. When he offered to help me carry some crates of hydrangeas to Martina's car, I should have declined. But the thought of those strong hands lifting something for me, even if just flowers, was too tempting to resist. As we worked side by side, the tension between us grew, unspoken but palpable. When our hands brushed while reaching for the same crate, it was like a spark leaping between us, igniting something I didn't dare name. "Sorry," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. "Don't be," he replied, his voice soft but firm. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. It was just us in that shop, surrounded by the scent of roses and lavender, the air heavy with something neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't deny. Then Martina's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Luke, are you ready?" she called from outside. The spell was broken. Luke straightened, his expression unreadable. "Thanks again, Cal," he said, his tone polite but distant. I watched him leave, a sinking feeling in my chest. I'd felt something in that moment, something real, something powerful. But he was engaged. To her. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the way he'd looked at me, the way his touch had lingered just a moment too long. I told myself it didn't matter, that I couldn't afford to feel this way about someone who wasn't mine to love. But my heart, it seemed, had other plans. The engagement party was nothing short of extravagant. Every inch of the expansive garden was draped in soft white linens, golden lights strung from towering oaks, and arrangements of peonies and gardenias I'd spent weeks perfecting. It was beautiful, sure, but the whole scene felt like it belonged in a glossy magazine rather than in real life. I busied myself near the flower displays, adjusting petals and repositioning vases that didn't need fixing. It was easier than watching the crowd of perfectly dressed guests flit around, toasting to love while my insides churned. Luke and Martina stood near the fountain, surrounded by laughter and flashes of camera phones. They looked like the ideal couple. Martina in her shimmering emerald dress, Luke in his tailored suit, smiling at all the right moments. But I couldn't stop focusing on him. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The way his fingers twitched at his sides when he thought no one was looking. I told myself to look away, to stop thinking about him, But my eyes betrayed me. They always found him. Cal. The sound of my name startled me, and I spun around to find Luke standing just behind me. Up close, the golden lights caught in his eyes, making them look impossibly bright. "You scared me," I said, trying to sound casual. "Sorry," he replied, though his smile said he wasn't sorry at all. "I wanted to thank you for all of this." He gestured to the flowers surrounding us. "It's perfect." Martina's thrilled. "Glad to hear it," I said, keeping my tone professional even as my pulse quickened. "Really," he pressed, stepping closer. "You've got a gift, Cal. The way you make this," he paused, gesturing at the arrangements, "feels so alive. It's amazing." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, and I turned back to the nearest bouquet, pretending to adjust a rose. "It's just flowers," I mumbled. "It's not," he said, his voice softer now. "It's you. Your attention to detail, the way you care about it. It shows." I glanced at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his expression. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have a minute?" he asked suddenly. "To step outside?" I hesitated, but before I could answer, he nodded toward the garden path that led away from the party. "Just for a moment. I need some air, and honestly, I could use the company." Against my better judgment, I followed him. The noise of the party faded as we walked further into the garden, the only sounds now the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant hum of cicadas. When we reached a small clearing, Luke stopped and turned to face me. "This isn't really my scene," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "The parties, the attention, it's all for show. It's not easy being the center of it all," I offered. "It's not just that," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's everything. Martina's family, the expectations. They've planned every detail of my life before I even have a chance to think. Sometimes I feel like I'm just," he stopped, shaking his head. "Like you're just going through the motions," I finished for him. He looked at me, surprised, and then he nodded. "Exactly." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be having this conversation. But the vulnerability in his eyes was disarming, and I couldn't walk away. "You're allowed to feel that way," I said finally. "It doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you human." He smiled faintly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It's not just the pressure. I don't even know if this is what I want. Any of it." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I was too afraid of the answer. "You're lucky, Cal," he said after a moment. "You're doing what you love. You've built something for yourself. I admire that." "It's not as glamorous as it looks," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe not," he said, his eyes meeting mine again. "But it's real. And that's more than I can say about most of this." I swallowed hard, the intensity of his gaze making it difficult to breathe. When he stepped closer, I didn't move. I couldn't. His hand brushed mine, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through me. It wasn't intentional, or maybe it was. Either way, it left me reeling. "Luke." Martina's voice rang out from the party, sharp and impatient. He pulled back, his jaw tightening. "I should go," he said, his voice laced with regret. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As he turned and walked back toward the lights and laughter, I stood frozen in the garden, my heart pounding in my chest. This connection between us, it shouldn't exist. But it did. And I didn't know how to stop it. The next time I saw Luke, it was at Martina's insistence. She wanted me to go over the final flower arrangements with him. Something about how he needed to feel more involved in the wedding planning. "He's too hands-off sometimes," she'd said with a laugh. "Maybe you can rub off on him. Cal, show him how to be more passionate about the details." If only she knew. Luke arrived at the shop in the late afternoon, his sleeves rolled up and a crooked smile on his face. He looked completely out of place amidst the chaos of my workspace. blooms scattered across tables, vases stacked in precarious towers, and my hands dusted with pollen and dirt. "Sorry for the mess," I said as he stepped inside. "I like it," he replied, glancing around. "It's alive. Feels like someone actually works here." I laughed, a bit nervously. "Yeah, well, it's not exactly a showroom." We went through the arrangements, but the conversation kept straying. He asked about my favorite flowers, what inspired me, how I got into this line of work. It was strange. He seemed genuinely interested, as if my answers actually mattered. "You know," he said as we wrapped up, "I could use a break from all the wedding stuff. Mind if I give you a ride back to your place? I'd love to see more of your designs." There was no reason to say no. None that I could say aloud, at least. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The drive started off light. We joked about the absurdity of wedding traditions and the sheer amount of money people were willing to spend on them. But the tone shifted as we neared my shop. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked suddenly, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I guess we all do, in a way. It's hard to figure out what's truly ours and what's just expected." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, that's exactly it." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something unspoken. When he pulled the car over, I thought he'd gotten lost. But then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Cal," he began, his voice low, "I don't know what this is, but I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "I know it's wrong," he continued, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "But being around you, it feels like the first real thing I've felt in years." I felt the same, but admitting it felt like crossing an invisible line I couldn't uncross. Still, the words slipped out before I could stop them. "I've never felt this way before," I said quietly. "About anyone." He exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath. "Neither have I." The next moment happened too quickly to process. He leaned over, his hand brushing mine, and suddenly his lips were on mine. It was soft at first, a hesitant question. Then the dam broke, and the kiss deepened, a rush of heat and longing that stole the air from my lungs. When we finally pulled away, the weight of what we'd done hit us both. This was a mistake," he said, his voice shaky. I can't hurt her like this." I nodded, even though my heart was screaming in protest. "You're right. We can't." But as he drove me the rest of the way home in silence, the tension between us was undeniable. A line had been crossed, and neither of us could pretend it hadn't happened. The days that followed were torture. Every time I saw Luke, the memory of that kiss burned between us like a secret flame. We tried to avoid each other, but Martina's insistence on involving him in every detail of the wedding made that impossible. And every time we were forced into the same room, the tension grew thicker. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Luke stayed behind as the others left. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice raw. "Neither can I admitted. But the words felt hollow, because I knew I wouldn't stop. And neither would he. We started finding excuses to see each other. Late-night visits to the shop. Early morning coffee runs. Brief, stolen moments where we could be ourselves, away from the expectations and lies. "I'm falling for you," he told me one night, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to feel joy, but all I felt was fear. "Luke, this can't end well." "I know," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "But I don't know how to stop." The guilt was unbearable, but so was the thought of losing him. Martina, oblivious to what was happening, started confiding in me about her future with Luke. She told me about their honeymoon plans, their dreams of starting a family. Each word felt like a knife to the chest. "I'm trapped, Cal," Luke said one night as we lay side by side, the world outside forgotten. "If I leave her, I lose everything. Her family, my career, Everything I've worked for. And if you stay? I asked, my voice breaking. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We both knew the truth. There was no way out of this without breaking something. Someone. And the weight of that truth was more than either of us could bear. The day of the wedding felt like a cruel joke. The sky was clear, the air crisp, but none of it mattered. I was surrounded by beauty, flowers, decorations, smiling faces, but none of it could distract me from the sinking feeling in my chest. I had spent hours preparing the arrangements, making sure everything was perfect, but it all felt hollow now. The delicate roses and lilies seemed like a mockery of what had once felt so real between Luke and me. As I made my way through the venue, delivering the final touches, my heart sank when I saw him. Luke. Standing at the altar next to Martina, his smile forced, his eyes distant. He was dressed in a tuxedo, looking every bit the part of the perfect fiancé. It was everything I had never wanted for him. And everything I'd secretly hoped he would choose me instead of. I couldn't look away, even though it hurt more than anything I had ever felt. Cal. I spun around at the sound of his voice. Luke was standing just outside the doors, his eyes wide, his expression pleading. Luke, I whispered, my voice cracking. I hadn't expected to see him before the ceremony started. I need to talk to you, he said quickly, looking around to make sure no one was near. I followed him down a quiet hallway, my pulse racing in my ears. My mind was a storm of thoughts, of regrets, of memories, of things that could never be. Cal, he began, his voice low. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say, but I have to tell you, what happened between us. I'll never forget it. I love you. But I can't do this. I shook my head, trying to stop the tears from rising. You've made your choice, Luke. You're marrying Martina. I know, he said, his voice breaking. But it doesn't change how I feel about you. I'm trapped, Cal. I'm too scared of the fallout, of disappointing everyone who's expected this from me my entire life. I can't walk away from her. From all of this. His words were like a knife, each one twisting deeper into my chest. I wanted to scream, to beg him to choose me, to fight for us, but I couldn't. He had already made his decision. I understand, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I understand. Luke's eyes were full of pain, but there was nothing more to say. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine in a final fleeting touch. I'm so sorry, Cal. I wish things were different. I know, I said, my heart breaking with every word. But they're not. They never will be. Luke's eyes searched mine, as if hoping for something, anything to change. But he knew, just like I did, that there was no turning back now. The silence between us felt suffocating. Then, with one last lingering glance, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, my heart in my throat. I had lost him. For good. The ceremony felt like a blur. I stood in the back, holding my breath, watching Luke walk down the aisle, his eyes briefly meeting mine. I saw the regret in them, those same eyes that had once looked at me with such raw, unspoken longing. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Martina stood beside him, smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I watched as they exchanged vows, as Luke promised his life to someone else. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized that I had been living for a love that wasn't mine to have. I left before the reception. I couldn't stay, couldn't watch them celebrate the life they would have together. It was too much. I walked back to my shop, the familiar scent of flowers filling my lungs. But it didn't bring me comfort. Nothing did anymore. I set the bouquet I'd been holding down on the counter, my hands trembling. I had loved him. I still loved him. But it didn't matter. Luke had chosen a different path. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I had to choose mine. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of someone who wasn't willing to fight for me. I had to rebuild my life, even if it meant doing so alone. It would hurt, of course. The memory of what we had, the love that never had a chance to bloom fully, would haunt me for years. But life moved on, as it always did. Luke, on the other hand, was left in the sterile silence of his new life. His marriage to Martina was everything he'd feared, empty, cold, and full of obligations that held him captive. He went through the motions, but his mind often drifted back to me. To us. To the love he had let slip away. But there was nothing he could do now. And for both of us, the pain would linger.